you're Adam Eve.
What?
Adam Eve isn't just Invincible's ride or die, she's a comic book icon in her own right, and in this video you're gonna find out everything about this heroine. There are major spoilers ahead in this video, you have been warned. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Eve's atomic beginnings. Adam Eve, real name Samantha Eve Wilkins, had a complicated life right from the start, to say the least. For one, she had already manifested her powers in utero, and her mother would end up dying shortly after giving birth to her. That's just scratching the surface of it though, because the Global Defense Agency, Earth's shady office for superhero affairs, already had their sights on her as soon as baby Eve was born. With plans on turning her into a formidable weapon working for the government, GDA agent Steven Erickson would attempt to take Eve from her dad, Elias Brandeworth, right after her birth. But Elias thought of a plan to prevent this. Ultimately, he did a classic soap opera style switcheroo by replacing Eve with another couple's baby in the hospital belonging to Adam and Betsy Wilkins. In doing so, Eve would grow up with the Wilkins, with not one of them knowing what truly happened on that fateful day at the hospital. Years would pass and Eve would turn into a rather precocious child with a knack for science. In the meantime, Brandeworth would pretty much keep an eye on his daughter regularly. Eve would notice him from time to time, but it would take longer for her to know the truth about her origins. Her powers would fully manifest one day when Betsy served her a plate of fried chicken, which she turned into a cheeseburger using her powers. From there, the young Eve would hone her abilities until deciding to get into the superhero biz and start fighting crime. During her first foray into vigilante work, Eve would stop a thief. More importantly, it was at this point in her life that Elias would reveal himself to his daughter and explain the circumstances of her birth. That, she was switched at the hospital, about how the government is looking for Eve to use her as a weapon, that whole deal. Ultimately, Elias would warn Eve to keep her powers private for fear of having the GDA hunt her down, but Eve simply brushes this off. A few years later, Eve would finally get the hang of superheroics and start wearing a costume and mask whenever she's out on patrol. This is where she started dubbing herself Adam Eve. She'd eventually come across a supervillain named Kilcannon, and after beating him, Elias would reappear to, again, warn her about publicly using her abilities. But as before, Elias's words fell on deaf ears. Little did Eve know what would happen next would have huge implications on her life. Now at this point, you guys should know that Eve was only capable of transmuting non-living matter, but that was all about to change when one of her crime-fighting adventures, Eve faced a crew of juvenile hostage takers. In this particular debacle, the gang of kids would ultimately reveal that they've taken Elias hostage. After a grueling battle with her foes, her real dad would reveal that she had the ability to transmute living matter as well. The only reason that she couldn't do it up until that point was because mental blocks were placed on her mind to prevent her from using this power and basically turning her into a god. In the end though, Eve would end up turning the delinquents into ash, but her problems didn't end there. Soon after that, GDA agent Steve Erickson would take Eve and Elias into custody. A struggle ensues and Steve would end up shooting Elias to his death. And just to kick her when she's down, Steve would even reveal to Eve that her real mom was still alive, but not for long, because he killed her too soon after. Stricken with grief, Eve would break through her mental blocks at that moment and use her powers to mind wipe Steve before leaving the scene. Now, Invincible isn't just about superpowered people punching other superpowered people, and we get front row seats to this when Eve gets home and has an argument with Betsy and Adam, because she might be a goddess walking among men, but she's still a teenager at this point. In this moment of frailty, Eve would even transmute a picture of her and the Wilkins, replacing Betsy and Adam with Elias and her real mom. The teenage years. Eve would enter high school and she'd meet Rex Sloan, aka Rexplode, during another encounter with Kilcannon. They tag team the villain and win. Afterwards, the two superheroes get to know each other a little better. Now, Rex is actually one of those kids that the GDA was able to acquire and turn into an asset. At this point in time, he was tasked with killing Cecil Stedman, the man who would eventually lead the GDA in the future. Instead, Rex turned on his employer, then GDA head Radcliffe, and ended up killing the guy. Eve would find out about this and decide to help Rex deal with the fallout of his actions, and believe us when we say that their tandem had Bonnie and Clyde vibes all the way. Because not long after that, Rex and Eve would team up to face the GDA. The agency would even try to invite Rex to join them, but he'd ultimately refuse and tell them that all he needed was Eve. Ah, young love. When Eve met Mark, they'd eventually shake the GDA off their tail, and after some time, both Rex and Eve would become part of the superhero group known as the Teen Team. Think of it as the Invincible Universe's version of the Teen Titans. Led by fellow superhero Robot, Eve and Rex would fight crime as, well, a team. And it was during their encounter with supervillain duo the Mauler twins that Eve would meet the person who would play one of the largest and most significant parts in her life, Mark Grayson, the superhero obviously known as Invincible. In fact, it would only take another day for Eve and Mark to discover that they are attending the same high school. Everything seemed peachy until the teen team received a mission to investigate Eve's school about a series of crimes involving students turning into human bombs. Rex and Eve would be assigned to this mission, but it would be herself and Mark who would end up stopping the perpetrator, their physics instructor named David Hiles. So far so good, right? Well, as you'd expect from the Invincible universe, even superheroes get all too human problems. Things started to unravel for Eve when first, she received news that Robot was leaving the teen team to join the Guardians of the Globe, the world's premier superhero team. Then, her personal life would fall apart when she discovered that Rex, who was her boyfriend at the time, cheated on her with fellow Guardian, Duplicate. With no one else to turn to, Eve would end up visiting Mark at his home and unloading her feelings on her new friend, something that Mark welcomed, to his credit. In the end, Eve would decide to leave the teen team and operate independently. Eve goes off on her own. As an independent crime fighter, Eve would usually go solo or team up with Mark from time to time. Over the course of her solo superhero stint, Robot would even try to invite her to join the Guardians, but she'd refuse due to the fact that Rex was part of the team too. Now guys, you should know that Eve was crushing hard on Mark at this point in her life, but you're gonna have to wait before they get together because Mark was still dating everyone's favorite Amber Bennett here. That is to say, you can think of Eve as more of a low-key admirer here than she was a full-fledged leading lady. In any case, Eve and Mark's friendship gradually deepened from here on out, especially after Eve witnessed his defeat at the hands of his dad, Omni-Man, or when she and Mark joined the Guardians of the Globe in fending off the first Flaxan invasion of Earth. Eve and Mark would also remain in each other's social circle outside of the spandex, as she'd end up briefly dating William, and they'd go on double dates with Mark and Amber at this point. On a side note guys, William's actually gay, but unlike in the animated series when he was out very quickly, William was portrayed as keeping this part of his life to himself until he decided to share it with his friends. It took a lot longer. Eve eventually reveals that the only reason she went out with William in the first place was to get closer to Mark. That's high school for you. Eve and Mark would graduate high school and she'd break up with William, and it was right after graduation that Eve would tell Mark that she has decided to hang the cape up and tights for good. Instead, she wants to use her powers for humanitarian work. Eve would then find herself relocating to Africa and becoming a one-woman NGO. However, to paraphrase an old adage, Eve didn't choose the superhero life. The superhero life chose her, because not long after her retirement, she'd get back in the pink spandex to assist the Guardians in defeating a supervillain named Omnipotus. Still, she'd continue her humanitarian work at the same time, even inviting Mark to Africa for a visit in hopes of hanging out with him alone. Mark would accept the invitation and go to Africa, but he brought Amber with him because again, they were still a couple at this point. But Eve rolled with it as she, Mark, and Amber had a pleasant time together, with the two superheroes even stopping an animal stampede before sharing a meal with one another. But their get-together is cut short when Mark receives an ominous phone call. Eve would basically fly Amber home, and she'd find out that his house got wrecked after getting into it with a dimension-hopping villain, Angstrom Levy. On the bright side, Amber and Eve would eventually find out that Mark's safe, and shortly after that, Mark would curiously pay Eve a visit, and they'd end up locking lips. Now guys, you should know that in no way is Mark a perfect person. He's just just as flawed as anyone else in the Invincible universe, but simply put, he's a guy just trying his best to do good in the world, but he makes mistakes. This first kiss with Eve though, well, it came as a surprise to both of them. Regardless if it was the fact that Mark discovered an alternate version of Eve who was in a relationship with him, or just pure teenage drama, the point remains, at this point, Eve and Mark had a good thing going between them. They wouldn't be able to explore their thoughts on the matter right away though, because Mark and Eve would end up helping the Guardians defeat the Sequids, an alien race from Mars. In the meantime, Rex would almost die after a run-in with the Lizard League on Earth. Now Mark and Amber would more or less end their relationship after wrapping up their Sequid mission, and he'd inform Rex about this when he visits him in the hospital. Not long after that, Eve would pay Rex a visit too, and finally patch things up between them. He'd then reveal to Eve that Mark and Amber are no longer a couple. This prompted Eve to pay Mark a visit so that they could finally talk about what exactly is going on between them. She would admit that she had already been crushing on Mark hard even when she was still with Rex, but Mark, well, he was still unsure about where their relationship stood at this point. That being said, kudos to Kurtman and Otley for nailing the whole will they won't they arc with Mark and Eve. Unsurprisingly enough, more superhero work got in the way of Mark and Eve further exploring their feelings for each other when GDA head Cecil Stedman requested their help to stop supervillain Dr. Seismic. Mark and Eve ultimately win against the villain and help the GDA's Reanimen and fellow superhero Darkwing too. Not long after that, Mark would uncover a conspiracy within the GDA, and he'd end up getting into a fight with Cecil and the Reanimen. This would have proved fatal too, since Cecil discovered that one of Mark's weaknesses is interrupting his ears and messing up with his equilibrium, but Mark would ultimately survive the encounter with the help of the Guardians. More importantly, he'd meet with Eve and tell her that he thought he was gonna die while fighting Cecil and the Reanimen. All he could think about that whole time was Eve. This sealed the deal for the two. Mark and Eve stopped being a thing and finally become a couple. For a time, Mark and Eve's life as a pair of superheroes in love went swimmingly. They'd fight crime, go on dates, enjoy each other's bodies, you know, the typical couple stuff. In fact, they'd become so close and comfortable with each other that Mark and Eve would end up establishing their own superhero firm called Invincible Inc. Trouble in Paradise. Eve and Mark's newly minted Invincible Inc. would have one hell of a first mission, as they had to deal with the Invincible War, where Angstrom Levy loose a bunch of evil Mark Graysons from an alternate universe to lay waste to the world. In the ensuing chaos, Eve would get severely injured and be put into a coma. The devastation during this event even ended up killing Rex after he detonated himself, a sacrifice that would save his fellow superheroes and kill one of the alternate Invincibles in the process. The war would ultimately end and their world would relatively survive. Eve would wake up from her coma after some time only to discover that Mark is in a one-on-one battle with a pure Viltrumite named Conquest. Being the ride-or-die woman that she is, Eve hops into action and assists Mark in defeating the Viltrumite warrior, but it doesn't go as smoothly as you'd think. For one, Conquest almost kills Eve. There's a silver lining here though, as getting impaled and nearly dying allowed Eve to break through her mental blocks and unleash her full power, which manifests as an energy beam that easily melts the skin and flesh off of Conquest. This unexpected attack gives Mark the opportunity he needs to land some haymakers on Conquest and beat his face to a pulp. Mark crawls towards Eve, miraculously completely unharmed and naked. Mark and Eve would attend Rex's funeral after defeating Conquest. Her ex-boyfriend's death would hit Eve hard, but there's a bright side here, since she and Mark would further deepen their connection to each other, culminating in one of the most romantic scenes in mainstream superhero comics. Not long after that, Eve would busy herself handling Invincible Inc. Everything seemed to be going well until Mark noticed one day how Eve was acting a little strange. This culminated one day when Eve discovered that she's actually pregnant with Mark's child. She wouldn't tell Mark about this just yet, and they'd even go on a mission to stop another alien invasion in the interim. In fact, Eve would first reveal her pregnancy to William, and just when we thought that she'd finally discussed his life-changing development baking in her oven, Mark would be called to task off-world again, this time by his dad Nolan and Alan the alien, to help in the Viltrumite war. Eve chose to delay the big reveal and seize Mark off, and it would take quite some time for Mark to return to his lover, and even then, Eve still couldn't find the right moment to tell him that she's carrying his child. This all came to a head after some time when Eve and Mark got together with Immortal and Duplicate for dinner. After seeing Kate's kids, Eve started to bawl her eyes out and step out of Kate and the Immortal's home. Mark confronted her and she would reveal that she decided to not keep the baby. The only thing Mark could do was apologize for not being there and comfort Eve. They then even made the decision for Eve to move in with Mark at the Graysons' house, but like always, having a quiet, regular life is out of the picture for these two. Not soon after moving in with him, Mark and Eve got into spats about how he dealt with Dinosaurus, the extremist who can be best described as a pure anti-hero. But what would prove to be another important point in Eve's life was when Mark got accidentally infected by the Scourge virus, the same contaminant that nearly wiped out the Viltrumite race. Eve would pay her lover a visit and realize that there's a chance that Mark might actually die from it. Make no mistake though, Samantha Eve Wilkins is made of far sterner stuff. Instead of feeling sorry for herself, she would handle their affairs with grace. First, there's the matter of Invincible Inc. Eve started to work with fellow superhero Bulletproof to run the business, and when he tried to make moves on her and get in bed with her, Eve didn't fall for the old lover in distress cliche and instead rebuffed Bulletproof's advances. Like we said, ride or die woman right here. Afterwards, she'd pay another visit to Mark as he recovered from the virus and ultimately play a large part in getting him to the Pentagon to undergo surgery after a whole mess with Alan, his brother Oliver, and Dinosaurus ended up with Mark breaking his arm. As expected, Eve was right there all the way. They'd end up clearing things with Alan and Oliver when all was said and done, and not to mention that Eve and Mark would consummate their love for each other repeatedly, if I might add. Mark even eventually regains his full powers. Eve becomes a mom. Eve would one day witness Mark seemingly die as it was captured by news outlets on TV, but thankfully it was a false alarm. He'd eventually come back home and reveal that it was a clone. However, this prompts Mark to tell Eve that he swears to be more careful with the way that he goes about things, especially considering that there's someone like her and his parents who worry for him. But the biggest bombshell comes when Eve reveals to Mark that she's pregnant again, and this time she's decided to keep it. Mark vows to support Eve with the pregnancy all the way, and she tells him that it's best to keep this a secret from everyone else for now. Suffice it to say that Eve's career as a superhero at this point was put on hold. For one, her pregnancy required special needs, which prompted Cecil Stedman to recommend a specialist named Sherry to help with Eve's condition. Sherry reveals to Eve that it's best to stop using her matter transmuting abilities at once, considering that it has the potential to harm the bun baking in her oven. Eve ultimately agrees to this, and hey, she and Mark even get engaged after she proposed to him. She'd share the news with William and his boyfriend Rick too, but the celebrations are put on halt when Angstrom Levy suddenly appears one night inside the Graysons' home. The dimension-hopping villain tries to kill Eve, but Mark just arrives in the nick of time to rescue her, to mixed results. After attacking Angstrom, Mark gets baited into entering one of his interdimensional portals. With Eve and Angstrom alone, the villain wonders why Eve hasn't tried once to stop him with her abilities. He then realizes that it's because she's with child, and the two get into a heated debate. Eve then basically scolds Angstrom for being the villain that he is, but despite what he did, she won't be looking for payback. All she wants now is to live a normal life with Mark and their child. Plus, she even makes Angstrom realize how much of a villain he's really been, considering that his powers could be way more beneficial if he used it for good. This triggers something in Angstrom, so he decides to get his act together and quit messing around with Mark. Simply put, Eve went full mom mode on Angstrom and made him quit being a supervillain. Mark would return to Eve shortly afterwards, this time with the alternate Invincible known as Mohawk Mark with him now. Now, Mohawk Mark would end up dragging Angstrom back to his own dimension, and life would go on for OG Mark and Eve. They'd even eventually reveal Eve's pregnancy to Nolan and Debbie. While living a quote-unquote normal life for someone like Eve and Mark seems to be a pipe dream, mainly it has to come to a point where Mark almost seemingly gets obsessed with getting back at Angstrom. Finding this out, Eve pretty much pleads with Mark to drop the whole deal and focus on building a family with her, but there's no stopping him. Mark believes that the only way to make sure Angstrom never interferes with their lives again is by taking him down once and for all. They get into a whole argument about this, which doesn't end well when Mark ultimately decides to go to Mohawk Mark's universe with Robot's help in search of Angstrom. To make things worse, unbeknownst to Eve, Robot would end up marooning Mark in that universe before coming back to their homeworld and telling her that he died died in that alternate dimension. At this point, guys, Robot has pretty much done a complete heel turn and had plans for conquering the entire world the whole time. Half a year would pass and Mark would find a way back to his home dimension. He visits Eve, who's surprised to find out that he's actually alive. Still, that doesn't change the fact that Mark made a stupid decision that ended up leaving her alone for 6 months, so Eve decides to end things with Mark. Robot discovers that Mark has returned to Earth and sends one of his drones to deal with him. The drone attacks Mark and Eve, gets caught in the crossfire, losing a leg in the process. In the end, Mark takes Eve and they escape to the Viltrumites' flagship, since at this point in time, the Viltrumites had made a deal with Earth to end hostilities between their races. Plus, Nolan has become the emperor of the Viltrumites, and he can help. Upon arriving on the Viltrumite ship and finding refuge, Eve gives birth to a baby girl they named Tara, and she also receives a prosthetic leg to replace the one that she lost to Robot. Eve and Mark leave Earth, realizing that Earth isn't a place to raise a child. With Robot basically becoming its dictator, Mark and Eve ultimately decide to migrate and raise their baby on Telescria, the capital of the coalition of planets, of which Alan the alien is now the leader. With the decision made, Eve and Mark would go on to say their final farewells to their friends, family, and allies. They'd visit the funerals of heroes like Kid Thor and Black Samson, people Robot killed in his bid for supremacy, have one last dinner at Eve's parents' house, and even pay William and Rick one last visit. By the end of their journey to Telescria, Mark and Eve would come up with the name Tara for their daughter. Their life on this new planet would be quiet, especially compared to the kind of lives they led before as superheroes. Alien invasions were replaced by finding palatable cuisine. Rushing to punch a villain would be replaced by rushing to the hospital to make sure Tara hasn't been poisoned. You know, relatively relatable problems that come with parenthood. However, throughout all this time, Eve has noticed that Mark has become rather elusive whenever she tried to get intimate with him. Ultimately, she'd find out the very dark reason behind his apparent reluctance to her advances, and it's a really big one, guys. You see, shortly after their breakup, a bit before Robot attacked them, the Viltrumite warrior Anissa forced herself on Mark, and he's become traumatized from the experience. In the end though, Eve proves yet again that she's an absolute queen and stands by Mark even through this difficult time. But we all know this by now. Human drama is always tempered with outlandish superhero action in the world of Invincible. Shortly after this, Alan contacts Mark and drafts him into helping assassinate Thrag, the rebellious former regent of the Viltrumite Empire. Mark would answer the call, and much like before, Eve would be left alone. And this time, Mark's gonna be gone for years because along the way, he inadvertently time travels to a different dimension set years before, back to a time when Mark had just gotten his Viltrumite powers. In that alternate universe, Mark would meet a version of Eve who's basically the same as his homeworlds, but instead of getting together with her, he'd continuously rebuff her advances, knowing that 1, she's not his Eve, and 2, this version of Eve was still dating Rex. Things would appear to turn back to normal when Mark manages to return to his homeworld. Well, as normal as you can expect from the Invincible universe. Eve and Mark together for 1,000 years. Mark realizes that half a decade has passed when he finally returns home. He reunites with Eve, who in spite of virtually abandoning her and Tara for years, welcomed him into open arms. It was a sweet reunion, all things considered, but no, they don't just get to live happily ever after just yet. For one, Eve reveals that during the 5 years that he was gone, she pretty much moved on with her life and started to go out with someone, although whether it's by fate or circumstance, Mark returned just a bit after Eve ended things with her lover. Mark was presumably dead for 5 years, so of course it's perfectly understandable that Eve would decide to try and move on. Add the fact that she was left to raise a baby all on her own, and on an alien planet no less. Thankfully, the writers didn't do this stupid thing with the story and had Mark lash out like he was in a soap opera, or worse, rant about how his manhood was threatened or something. Instead, Mark fully understands why Eve did what she did and realizes how crappy of a husband and dad he's been before they ultimately rekindled their relationship and got back together. Oh, and of course, they finally get married. But the adventures don't end there. Eve would also participate in finally putting an end to Thrag and his fraction of the Viltrumite supremacists. She'd be one of the superheroes present during the war against Robot and his drones, and in the end, Mark and Eve would ascend the Viltrumite throne to become its people's new rulers. And in a rare instance where Kurtman, Otley, and Walker actually gave one of Invincible's characters an honest-to-goodness happy ending, Eve would discover that her powers have granted granted her immortality, which allows her to be with Mark for as long as he lives. And in the closing scene of the series, we see these two finally living the quiet life they've longed for. And with that, everyone, Eve and Mark live happily ever after.